CSS is the co-sponsor, one of the co-sponsors of this session, and we had a hand, and we're very proud of it, in helping to form the new alliance that we think is so critical. We think the continued success of public housing in this city is in your hands. It depends on the success of this alliance and the structuring of an effective role for tenant leadership at Nycha decision-making tables. Residents of public housing are facing dangerous times. I don't need to tell you that. The new federal housing law gives Nycha unprecedented flexibility, but less money to operate public housing. And that, of course, is a dangerous and volatile combination. In addition, the recent resignation under pressure of Nycha Chairman Ruben Franco means that the future leadership of Nycha is uncertain. One thing, however, that is certain, that our mayor is going to play a critical and decisive role in appointing the new chairman. I draw your attention to recent news articles that one of the individuals who's going to also play a role is Peter Powers, one of the mayor's closest aides. I worked with Peter Powers in his effort to privatize public hospitals. That was a bitter fight, and I can't say it wasn't. We are dealing in ideological times, and Peter Powers talks directly to the mayor's ideological position. So we are not in a sidelight anymore. This is becoming center stage to what's going to be happening on a whole host of topics. The new law, which many of you know about, called a reform, is actually a continuation of the concept known as devolution. This means that the federal government curtails its responsibilities and lets the state and local authorities deal with problems in any way they see fit. The law is called the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. It links the right to keep an apartment in a housing project with tenant responsibility. Frankly, I'm offended. I don't see people getting subsidy in major corporations being asked to take the same kind of responsibility, but clearly poor people and people of color are on a different category under this law. That concept has been embraced by some of the leadership in Congress, but this should sound a warning to all public housing residents and advocates about what's in front of you. The new welfare to work movement is an example of devolution at its worst, reducing welfare rolls and not providing any real support for jobs. And that's been the primary outcome, certainly in New York, and I draw your attention not to my words, but every news article you see as to what's really going on in New York. We should make certain that this sort of attitude is not allowed to drive the implementation of this housing law. We have to stand now, or it may be too late. The law is intended to deregulate public housing, but it requires that HUD's current regulations governing resident participation be kept intact, in large part because of what you've already done, what your leadership has already done. You fought early enough. Under these regulations, residents have the right to organize development by development. These elected resident associations should and must be, given what's happening, be the building blocks for forming a citywide resident advisory board to plan and work collaboratively with Nycha on policy issues. This forum and the alliance are vital, and I can't stop saying it. When they see silence on the other side, they'll roll over us. I'm sorry. That's a fact of life, and we can't hide from it anymore. We have to get out the word in a way that's effective to all the people. Let the people make the decision. Don't force, but let them know the stakes involved for them and their families. Organize and get involved in operations of your development. You must do it now. Keep current on what's happening as the new law goes into effect. Is Nycha really cooperating with resident associations? We hope so, but you got to demand for it. Or is it continuing to frustrate tenant participation in policy decisions and withholding information about these policies? Resident vigilance and involvement are key to steering the authority on the best course. Not only the best course for the current political leadership, but for you who are residents, and because you represent 700,000 people, the size of San Francisco, the fate of the city is involved in this. Can we live as people of moderate means in this city? And that's what's at risk here. If this goes, what's going to happen to our communities? Not only the housing authorities, what's going to happen to all the things that we know as community in my own Bedford-Stuyvesant, in the South Bronx, across this city for people who aren't rich and don't get special parking spaces, as was given away recently. New York City has some of the most successful public housing in the nation. Everyone repeats that mantra. There's a list of over 200,000 families waiting to get in because of problems in the private rental market. People need this housing desperately. This makes future operations of Nycha all the more important for the entire well-being of every New Yorker. If this success of public housing is to continue, Nycha's 60-year mission and role as the primary source of decent, affordable housing must be maintained. Nycha should be actively involving resident leaders in the policy-making process of the authority. By working together, Nycha and its residents can weather the storms of change and improve conditions for every New Yorker. Thanks for letting us be involved. This is important stuff.
I know today the goal is to talk about what the new legislation is, what it means, where its implementation is going, and how people can be a part of it, and I want to address that. Let me just say a couple of opening points about this forum before I get into the meat of that. I heard the end of David Jones's remarks, and David and CSS and HUD work together regularly, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we disagree, but we work together very regularly, and we try and find some common solutions. David made some very strong points about sort of where is the philosophy of government, where is the philosophy of federal government going, what does it mean for New York City? And let me just say that I don't think we should in any way underestimate the importance of that message, because there has been a sea change in this nation during the 90s in the approach to housing policy and the approach to economic development policy. A lot of it could be said to stem from the 1994 election and the turnover of both houses of Congress. And I think it's very important for people to say, what has that meant sort of in the years after that pivotal moment? What have the ramifications been? And one of the core issues is de-evolution, as David pointed out. You know, from Secretary Cuomo's perspective, de-evolution is definitely a mixed bag. He's the first to say there are certain advantages to empowering local communities. And any local community, and anyone who's been in local government in particular, can tell you the many, many elements of the relationship between federal government and local government, state government and local government that are onerous and difficult and unresponsive, and why de-evolution on one level is very sensible and worthy, and why it in fact empowers grassroots people. At the same time, de-evolution can be a difficult process, and a process that does open up some negative possibilities. And I think David was hitting on a key point. If de-evolution means that there's a guard let down on issues of fairness, or if it means that those who are less empowered have less voice, or if it means that people who don't have as much political muscle don't get as much say in the governing process, then de-evolution is not what it was intended to be, certainly not what its rhetoric suggests. So I always urge people to look at the changes that we've experienced in these last few years with a critical eye and think what the community involvement needs to be to answer those changes. HUD may have been an agency that some people in Congress thought had outlived its usefulness. Secretary Cuomo argued, Secretary Cisneros before him argued, well, that's a veiled message. That's not really the whole message. The message is also about HUD's constituency, cities, people of color, low-income people, you name it. You can name any number of groups of folks that were not necessarily in vogue with the people who happened to lead Congress at that moment. And the attack on HUD we saw as having a much deeper meaning. We think, not that we're out of the woods at this point, but that we're doing somewhat better. And we think, even more importantly, that the national debate on affordable housing, which essentially was non-existent after the 1994 election, has come back into, if not an ideal state, at least a state where it's now a valid issue again. It's an issue that's getting some attention. It's an issue on which people are actually talking about utilization of resources once again. And last year in Congress was a key example of this. That congressional session on the housing side was not just about the question of so-called public housing reform. It was about other issues like the FHA loan limit issue. It was about the issue of empowerment zones. It was about the issue of Section 8 vouchers and the overall HUD budget. When we at HUD look at that whole picture, we have to say something happened. Something surprising happened. HUD got almost $2 billion more in its budget than the year before. The Section 8 voucher situation improved significantly for the first time in years. 50,000 new vouchers, another 40,000 vouchers freed up. Obviously, the public housing reform bill passed, but it was in a very different form than it would have been if the House Bill DeBlasio bill had passed untouched. And we actually think on the number of contentious issues, we were able to pull back to a more acceptable place that bill and make it something that we could live with, although we're not entirely satisfied with, to say the least. But bluntly, at the start of that legislative year, I think we did not expect a particularly large budget increase. Excuse me, we did not expect more Section 8 vouchers. We did not expect at all a positive or even acceptable outcome on public housing reform. We were very surprised when the package came together and it was something we could live with. Again, the why. Well, I'll support my boss here and say part of it was Secretary Cuomo was very persistent and happens to be a very good negotiator. But I'll also say because at the grassroots level and in the larger debate, something changed to open up that door. It's not accidental. The President talked about some of these issues in the State of the Union last time. Again, this time, he mentioned the need for more Section 8 vouchers going forward. He's in fact proposed another 100,000 for this new budget and then 100,000 for the budget after that. The President talked about community development banks the other night. He talked about fully funding empowerment zones. Something has happened to put these issues back in a more debatable place in the national agenda. And I think it also speaks to the fact that political leaders throughout the country have realized the dangers of turning against urban policy and turning against HUD and turning against some of the programs that actually have worked. And I think that's very healthy. It means that we now have more of a level playing field. And it will only stay that way. I don't think anyone should rest on their laurels here. It will only stay that way if the debate continues to be fueled by grassroots input. A word to the wise. We have a proposal on the table backed by the President of the United States, 100,000 new vouchers next year. If no one says anything about that, that will go down in flames. Again, David Jones's point. It's there, it's in writing, it's formal. Now, let's see if it's going to happen. It will only happen with real input. Moving now to the public housing bill. And I always enjoy the title Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. In essence, your concern, if I understand correctly, has been what is going to be the tenant role in this. You've heard me say that we think we were able to keep this bill from being something much worse. Obviously, knocking out so-called graduation requirements, modifying and making less onerous community service requirements, creating a better approach, we think, to income mix than the original proposal, and amplifying in the bill the need for tenant input. It is an open question what that will look like, but I think everyone understands the magnitude. We're talking about a 5-year planning process with 1-year increments within it. It covers just about everything: admissions policy, maintenance issues, operations issues, just about everything I think you would consider pivotal to day-by-day management of the housing authority. From our point of view, starting today, we need to work with you closely to understand the kind of input you think works and to structure it with you and with Nycha. And we are going to give Nycha the benefit of the doubt. We're coming to the table saying we want to hear how the tenants want to structure this input. We want to work with you on it. We're not going to assume a negative up front. We're going to work with them to see if we can create something that works for everyone. But we do know it has to be input that's as wide-ranging as possible, public meetings involving current tenant leaders, broad geographical outreach, and really hitting on all of these issues. On February 18th, there will be a couple of key publications in the Federal Register, a guide to all the ramifications of the act that was passed by Congress, as well as rules related to what these 5-year plans and 1-year plans should look like. So in just about a month, we'll get a lot more detail on it. But the key, from our point of view, is to start work today on getting your proposal for how we should structure the tenant input, and we are happy to be an honest broker working with Nycha to see as much of that come to fruition as possible.
Let me first of all commend my co-sponsors, I guess, New York City Public Housing Resident Alliance, Community Service Society, and the Legal Aid Society in terms of bringing us together for this very, very important forum. I was just sitting there looking at Anne's button. I think it said, protect and improve public housing. That needs to be the mantra for all of us, going out to protect and improve. And one way we can do that is by coming together, being a part of forums, and then moving out from here to tell everybody what is at stake and why we must be involved. As David Jones said earlier, with the 700,000 or so residents in public housing, we must work to ensure that housing remains available. And that is critically important because we're also facing a situation with Mitchell-Lama developments here in the city. And we all know that about 20 years or so, when Mitchell-Lama was created, there was this little clause, maybe we don't all know it, but there was this little clause that states after 20 years, a developer can buy out of the Mitchell-Lama program. And as such, now that time is here. And as such, many of the developers are seeking to buy out of the program and seeking to create market rate rents for those developments. Now we know lots of folks, personally and family members, who live in Mitchell-Lama. And if they're now paying $600, $700, $800 a month, and their rents suddenly jump to $1,500, $2,000 a month, they will not be able to pay the rent. So affordable housing is being potentially attacked on that end of Mitchell-Lama, and we're seeing what is happening on the end of public housing. When you put all of this together and you put all of the people who are potentially caught up in this, we really have a potential crisis on our hands. So our being here tonight to work on behalf of making sure that what is now in law takes place and that the vision that we all have for that happens, I think is so important. We want to stay informed, and we want to stay informed about our rights as well as our options. I think it is very significant that last year, while Congress was deliberating on changes to the law concerning public housing, the New York City Public Housing Resident Alliance was able to make its voice heard clearly and effectively in Washington. Certainly the previous two speakers talked about that, but I think that it is certainly worth noting again because as a person who served as a member of the City Council for 8 years, the legislative body of the city, I am all too aware that things can happen when people speak out. Changes can take place when your voices are heard. And not any of us should feel comfortable sitting back, expecting or assuming someone else is going to speak for us. Nor should any of us assume that those whom we elected automatically know the issues, understand them, and that they're going to be top priority of that elected person's list. We have many things we're concerned with, but when you let your voice be heard, this is a clear example of what can happen. The result was that many of the measures that were proposed and advocated by the Residents Alliance became part of the law. And again, you made it happen. But perhaps most significant was the preservation of 964 regulations that empower public housing residents. Those provisions of the law spelling out the residents' rights, including the right to create resident advisory boards at each New York City Housing Authority development and also citywide. Now these boards, as it has been stated previously also, are invested with the power to play a tremendous role in setting NYCHA policy and management of NYCHA development. I know not any of you who are here takes this lightly because you know the importance of that. But what we must be able to do is to get those 700,000 or so, or 600,000 or so who are not here to know what it is that you know, and to be prepared in making sure that the roles that have been set out in this new legislation, in fact, so these new policies move forward. This important provision of the law was threatened, we know, in Congress last year, but again, the advocacy of the Residents Alliance on this issue made a major difference in Washington and resulted in a tremendous victory for public housing residents all over America. Now that we won that victory, it's up to all of us to build on it and really make these advisory boards a strong and positive force in Nycha. Now all of the changes made last year in public housing law, some of which, like you, I supported, and some of which, like you, I oppose, are taking effect. These changes obviously are going to have direct impacts on the more than 100 public housing developments here in Manhattan and beyond that have more than, here in Manhattan, 54,000 apartments and more than 120,000 residents. So this forum is indeed important. It is a part of an ongoing effort to reach out to all, to inform all of those public housing residents, and that's why it's being videotaped, and we hope that after tonight you will get a copy of the videotape once it is available, and as leaders in your respective developments, that you will take the lead in showing it to your neighbors so that they know what their rights are, so that they know what their options are. And as Manhattan Borough President, I will commit that I will continue to work with the Residents Alliance, to work with many of you in other different ways, with the Community Service Society, and of course with the Legal Aid Society, to ensure that all of the public housing residents continue to enjoy and exercise your rights. Use us. Make sure that we do our part, and as long as you do your part, I think we can assure the livability and the continuing existence of public housing for you, for your children, for your grandchildren, as a viable part of the city, people who care desperately about the city, and people clearly who are willing to go out to protect and improve public housing. Thank you very much.
I'm Vic Bach. I'm with CSS, and my job is to give you a bird's-eye view of the new law called the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act. Doesn't sound like that has to do with public housing, but it does. And I'm going to describe briefly the changing rules of the new game for Nycha, for HUD, and for residents. To begin with, the law started a few years ago when housing authorities around the country were faced with serious threats from Washington. There were repeated attacks on the public housing program, cuts in budgeted funds, and a proposal floating around that was very serious and threatening to voucher out all of public housing. In other words, let's forget about preserving the public housing stock, about preserving public housing communities. Let's just give residents vouchers, let them take them wherever they want to go, and let the housing survive however it may. In response, the housing authorities hammered out a deal with decision makers in Washington that formed the basis of the new law we're dealing with now. HUD agreed to drop the voucher idea, thankfully. Authorities accepted the limited federal funds they would be getting from Washington, provided that in return they got unprecedented new powers and flexibility to run their own operations in order to survive and come out okay on the bottom line. Under the new act, basically, what does this mean for New York City residents? It means that under the new act, Nycha will, like other, I'll call them new age housing authorities, because this is a new age for public housing, will behave more like a business. more like a private business, making sure it meets the bottom line in order to make up for what Washington isn't sending by way of subsidies to keep the housing alive. And it will start looking less like the Nycha we have known and in some ways come to love over the last 60 years. Terms like asset management. Everybody know what that means? The housing authority as entrepreneur. That's a very popular term now for describing what housing authorities need to do. Public-private partnerships. Those terms are being used to describe the New Age Housing Authority, and they may make us uncomfortable. It's kind of technical, policy wonk vocabulary, and they're a far cry from the bread and butter issues about conditions at specific developments. But if you, as resident leaders, are going to have a voice in Nycha's plans and decisions, as you must, it's a vocabulary that we all have to come to grapple with over the near future. What kinds of changes are in store at Nycha? I can only project on the basis of some things we already know and some things we can easily speculate about. Nycha is going to try to do, basically, it has to do two things. It has to try to maximize its rent collection in order to make up for what support Washington is no longer providing. Washington's writing a limited check and saying, here's your money, you make do with whatever you're getting. Secondly, it has to improve its capital position, its net worth, its value. How will Nycha increase the rents it collects? Well, you know some of the answers. It's going to reconsider ceiling rents, consider raising them or ending them. It's going to start giving preference, it already has, to widening the range of incomes of families it admits to public housing, because the higher income families, the working families, when they're admitted, will pay higher rents, limited by the Brooke Amendment that limits rents to 30% of income, but they'll pay higher rents than some of the lowest income families with the most serious housing needs. Of course, what this means is that many of the doors of public housing will be increasingly closed to those lowest income families with the most serious housing needs. It means there's going to be a temptation for Nycha to give housing vouchers. It still gives out Section 8 housing vouchers to those lowest income families and open up vacant units and other units to families on the waiting list at the higher range of the allowable income. It also means under the law that Nycha can now skip over families on the waiting list in order to get to those higher income families. The law actually has a provision saying that is permissible. Another thing Nycha has to do to increase rents is to take back community spaces. In order to do what? In order to rent them, possibly for commercial or other purposes, so it gets some rental income at commercial market rents that will help pay for the public housing that it runs and manages. And we saw a glimpse of this asset management plan. Those of us who were involved in the Moving to Work application, they were part of the application. And of course, the resistance of tenants, the opposition of tenants across the city was strong enough to get Nycha to withdraw that proposal. But we're still going to see those ideas coming out and start getting actively practiced. How will Nycha improve its net worth? Well, it's going to consider what it does with those of its developments that are more marketable, that are better located, that are in neighborhoods where they can command high prices. So I think some of us may see, I hate the term when applied to public housing, I don't mind in other instances, we're going to see possibly a movement toward privatization of some public housing developments by seeing that they're rented to higher income families, they don't need as much subsidy, and they're more marketable for possible sale, maybe in some cases for sale to residents who can afford it, perhaps not to those who can't. What are we also going to see? We're going to see Nycha start to invest its funds, whatever the proceeds are it earns from sales, some of the capital funds it gets from Washington, to invest them in private developments that have high expected returns. Under the law, Nycha is permitted and encouraged, like all housing authorities, to invest in what are called mixed finance private developments, provided those developments provide some units for public housing. But the problem with that is that those units that are leased for public housing, those are leased for 10 to 20 years. You heard what Virginia Fields, the Borough President, said about Mitchell-Lama. What happens when subsidies expire? Are residents supposed to move after the 10-year lease expires and the owner says, goodbye, I don't need the subsidy arrangements anymore? Those are difficult questions even for Nycha to answer, and we have to be alert. The third thing Nycha is going to do to improve its position is consider upgrading some of its lowest income developments, gentrifying them, those that are in poorer locations, using a combination of demolition and redevelopment. And we see some of that in Hope 6. Certainly in Brooklyn, in Prospect Plaza, where demolition will occur of public housing, and there will be upgraded development occurring around the existing site. Two other options are available to Nycha. One is to cut waste. Does Nycha waste money? I bet residents have a suggestion box full of ideas about how Nycha can start saving money to better support the housing it runs. And finally, the other option is the unthinkable one. I don't know that Nycha is going to want to think about it either, and that's for Nycha to disinvest. That is, to simply allow the housing and the quality of services to deteriorate in order to cut losses. And we see some of this now in the state-assisted public housing stock since Governor Pataki, particularly since Governor Pataki has terminated operating subsidies to that stock. In all of this, what's the bottom line for residents? The bottom line, as all of the speakers have indicated, is what makes Nycha accountable to you? What makes Nycha accountable to residents? The new law has just a few answers, but we better make the best use of them we can. First is that Nycha has to prepare written plans, a 5-year plan, 1-year plan every year. So there has to be something in writing. Second, it has to hold public hearings on those plans. So get ready for your 3 minutes of testimony before the buzzer goes off. Most importantly, Nycha must see to the creation of a citywide resident advisory board that is involved in the preparation of its plans. And the question for this group here, and it will be discussed by our panel, I'm sure, is how should that resident advisory board be composed? Should it be appointed or elected? How does it relate to the basic building blocks of tenant associations? How does it relate to the existing ICOP structure? A lot of questions that you need to find the answers to. So I will simply conclude by saying that we hope that these mechanisms for accountability, plus the victory the Resident Alliance won in making sure that the 964 regulations remain intact, will provide the leverage that residents need to have an equal playing hand in the changing game with Nycha, with a more assertive Nycha, and maybe a HUD that stays more in the background as public housing is deregulated. In that sense, the new law puts high costs on residents. Those costs are that you be more informed, more vigilant, more organized, more prepared, more involved in getting to that table where Nycha makes its plans and decisions. Thank you.
There's really good news about rent, which is that tenants like you and tenants all over the country fought very hard to keep something called the Brooke Amendment, which limits your rent increases to 30% of your income. And because tenants fought for that, it's kept in the bill so that your rent cannot be more than 30% of your income. That's very important. Housing Authority doesn't like you to know that, but that is what the law is. There's also provisions in the new law for something called flat rents, which are rents that are flat, based on, usually based on the size of the apartment. They also have ceiling rents in New York City, so that your rent, so that if you're a working person, your rent will not be 30% of your income, but will be less than that. And you have an option to opt, you will have an option, not right now, but soon, to opt for either a flat rent or brook rent, which is 30% of your income. The good news about this is that let's say you opt wrong, you make a mistake. You say, oh, the flat rent seems like a good deal now, and then you lose your job. You get to switch back to 30% of your income. That was very important. What they wanted to do was say, you have to choose one or the other, and if you choose wrong, you're really in trouble because we're not going to reduce your rent. Now, a lot of this is going to depend on what the Housing Authority decides to do, and it's important for tenants to be organized for that reason, because the Housing Authority gets to decide, are they going to have flat rents? How are they going to do the flat rents? What rate are the flat rents going to be set? There are other parts of the law that that the Housing Authority can't decide. There are certain what they call disregards, which means automatic deductions. The Housing Authority can't decide that. There's a bad thing in the new law about rent, which is that if you get sanctioned from welfare, if you're on public assistance and welfare cuts you off, they don't have to reduce your rent even though you have no income. And this is going to be a big problem for people, and we have to, people who are tenant leaders and are seeing these problems, you need to start sending people to legal aid and legal services office, because people are going to get evicted for this and for things that are not their fault. And this is where all these problems we're seeing with welfare are going to come in, because welfare is cutting people off all over the place for no good reason. You don't show up one day, they cut you off. Your kid is sick and you don't go to your work program, they cut you off. We're going to start seeing this impact in public housing. We're going to start seeing people, them trying to throw people out just because welfare has cut them off. And we've got to stop that from happening. Because this is part of the Housing Authority's plan. They want to get rid of people who are on public assistance from the Housing Authority. They're trying to do that now. And this is another way that the Housing Authority can evict people. There's another bad thing, which is that there's this thing called minimum rents, which says, even if your income is nothing, we still charge you $50 a month. Well, that doesn't seem a lot, but if you've lost your job, or you've been cut off public assistance, or you're in between a situation, your rent should be $0, not $50. Now, the Housing Authority here has an option of making it nothing, which is what it should be. If you have no income, why should you be paying rent? It's just not fair. So this is another place where tenant agitation might help. Why should people who have no money pay rent? They shouldn't have to. We should be getting them back on so that they can pay rent. Another good part of the new law is that they kept in something called good cause for evictions, which means that they can't evict you for any reason. Kalman Finkel can't wake up tomorrow and say to you, I don't like you and I'm going to evict you. They have to have a reason for doing this. That's very important. People who live in private houses don't have that right. So they can just get evicted for no reason at all. So it's important for public housing tenants to keep that right. The one thing that's a problem, though, in the new law is that they're going to start giving you leases. And you may think, oh, a lease is a good thing, right? I want a lease. This lease is a bad thing. And that's what these new leases are for. They're to put in a requirement that says, if you don't do community work, we can evict you. Now, there are a lot of exclusions from community work, but the problem is what I was talking about before. Let's say you lose your job. Let's say public assistant, you're having trouble with public assistance and they cut you off. You are subject in that case to the community work requirements. And if you don't do the community work requirements, they can evict you. And since these are the people that the Housing Authority wants to evict, right? They want to evict people who are not paying more money in rent. So you're going to start seeing, I'm going to answer questions at the end. So you're going to start seeing people who are in a really horrible situation. You know, welfare's cut them off, or they've lost their job, they haven't gotten unemployment, and those are the very people who need help are the ones that the Housing Authority is going to try and evict. And this Housing Authority is going to try and evict them. And you all are leaders, and you need to look out for this, because they are going to need your help to make sure this doesn't happen. And they're going to need you to be loud in your development to say these are not people who should be evicted. Lastly, I want to talk about admissions, which is who is getting into public housing. Half of all admissions for public housing in New York alone, in the whole country, go to people who really need it. The other half go to people who are working. Not necessarily to people who are working and need the housing, but just to people who are working. That's where the New York City Housing Authority is going. They don't want to admit people who are doubled up in public housing. They don't want to admit the sons and daughters of people who have grown up in public housing. They want to admit only people who can pay more money in rent. And unfortunately, this new law lets them do that. And it's something that we're going to have to fight long and hard about. Vic talked about the community, about the 5-year plan. There's plans that they have to submit. Who they're going to admit to public housing is part of that planning process. And you need to be a part of that. You need to say who's going to be in public housing. And part of the thing you need to say is there are a lot of doubled up families in public housing and they need to get in. And it's not fair to say they can't get in. And it's not fair to say people have grown up their whole lives in public housing can't get in because they're on public assistance. But that's what the current administration is saying. We all know that with Franco leaving, things may only be getting worse, not better. That's unfortunately what David Jones was talking about, that we can't necessarily think because Franco wasn't our friend that whoever replaced him is going to get better. But a lot of this is our next 3 years is going to be trying to prevent really bad things from happening by organizing against them so that we have public housing to protect after the mayor is not with us anymore.
Folks, we've been talking about 964. A lot of us have mentioned 964, 964. And a lot of folks may or may not be familiar with HUD's 964 regs, but for folks who are familiar with it, I think everyone would agree that the 964 regulations are like the Bible of the public housing resident movement. Why is that? Because 964 says all of the right things in theory, in language. 964 speaks about power for residents. What does 964 say? 964 says that residents shall have the right to organize in public housing, that residents shall have the right to establish organizations at the development level and at the citywide level. 964 says that residents shall have a voice in shaping the management and operating practices of housing authorities throughout the country. 964 says all of the right things. The language is powerful, and that's why it's important. The challenge is to put that into practice, to make that language real, which is what a lot of us who've lived in public housing, who've been active in public housing for years have been trying to do. And why is 964 important? Because under this new law, under all of this increased flexibility that housing authorities will have in making decisions, with all of this increased decision-making power, residents still have a role in shaping what decisions emerge from a housing authority's planning process. Under the new law, as Vic, Judith, and others have mentioned, housing authorities have to create annual plans and 5-year plans that outline how they intend to manage their public housing stock. These plans have to touch on issues such as rent issues, whether or not a housing authority will maintain ceiling rents to help to keep working families in public housing, whether or not housing authorities intend to offer income disregards, which helps to facilitate the transition of people who've been unemployed in public housing to work. The plans must touch on safety and security issues. Housing authorities have to outline in their 1-year plan how they intend to increase safety and security in public housing. The plans must touch on demolition and sales issues. Housing authorities have to indicate in their 1-year plan whether they intend to demolish or sell public housing or privatize public housing. There's a lot of power in these plans, as the previous speakers have indicated. But with all of this power, with all of this flexibility that housing authorities now have, the new law also did something good. And that is that it gave residents a defined role in this decision-making process, bringing residents to the table. Under the new law, housing authorities have to establish what are called resident advisory boards. These are boards of residents that must be representative of the population of residents within that particular housing authority jurisdiction. These resident advisory boards, or RABs, as they're being called now, these RABs are our opportunity to shape the policies that surround rents, to shape the policies that surround admissions, to shape the policies that surround demolition and the selling off of public housing. Here's our opportunity to get that influence that we've been talking about for the longest.
I agree with my colleague. The Council of Presidents have not been active. They have been discouraged not to participate in the issues affecting public housing here in New York City. And I'm delighted that we have this Resident Alliance group here under the leadership of Mr. Dushaw, who is young, energetic, bright, and it's really great that we can do this now. And I think we're going to be successful. We're making some progress already. It is a glow of light, a glow of hope that we can move forward dealing with the issues of public housing. One of the more pressing issues now is the demolition of public housing in my district, Prospect Plaza. They are planning to actually tear down public housing. This will probably be the first in New York City, and it is in fact a challenge. They plan to build condominiums or co-ops. Whatever the issue is, the demolition of public housing could be a very, very dangerous thing. Wherever poor folk live, it is difficult to organize. People are out trying to survive, making a living, and the chances of organization become limited. But we do have some people who are committed to keeping public housing, and not only just keeping it, but continuing to build public housing. It's done a fantastic job in the country, and we need more of it. We do have some people who are supporting people like myself and people like people around in this panel. We have the Community Service Society, the Legal Aid Society, as well as a number of organizations who historically have supported working class people in this city. We need to continue to press the authorities here in New York City. We unfortunately have a mayor who has not been very friendly for public housing, and I'm not sure how friendly the mayor's been with poor people. And I think that attitude has drifted down to each of the commissioners, the Board of Education, the Housing Authority, the Department of Social Service. Each commissioner takes on the attitude and desires of the mayor, and it's become a very mean situation here. So we're faced with that now. We do understand it. I happen to be an elected official. I was the district leader, like our borough president, for many years, and I've served. I continue to serve as school board member in District 23 for 22 years. So we understand that we've got to continue to organize. Without it, we're just finished. So I'm delighted that we have this group, and I think that we're going to make some progress here.
Ron, thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw, can you give us your spin, please?
Okay. My name is Anne Bradshaw, and again, the president of Taft Houses. I've been the president since 1981, and I don't know what my next thing will be as far as running again. However, my title is to deal with the problems of ICOP. However, I think it could not have been better explained than by Ms. Diane Jackson. And what I would like to see is that what needs to be changed and how. I have a few suggestions. I'll make it very brief. However, we should change the way our modernization funds are handled by Housing Authority with the contracts. We should be from the beginning with the specifications. Don't bring us a manual that's already printed, already designed, already made up, and give it to us and tell us this is what we have to do. And then it is sent out to bids, and then we stand without them or us having any input into that contract at all. So I think that that's one of the things we need to work on and do at a later point. Our program funds also for residents at every development should be, they should provide space, and as much as needed, we should have an educational component for our development, after school and adult education program, preferably, and a social worker to assist the residents, have an on-site resident, social worker resident, so that they can help us. This is also in our 964.
Yes.
Okay? Now here, for residents to operate as an association like Nycha, as an autonomous entity funded by HUD, also to retain our status as resident associations too, as stated in 964 regulations, but not adhered to, we should be allowed to be funded in a manner like HUD, so that we too can either have a citywide or district council budgets that should be allocated from HUD. We need to have the funds necessary, like New York City Housing, that is getting funded from HUD. We need that. Residents should be trained to give us the opportunity to gain knowledge and hone skills in the areas of economic and community development. And lastly, we should get our local congressmen and senators. They should meet occasionally with the residents in a forum or seminar to see how each development has spent the monies they have voted for us and allocated to New York City Housing Authority. And we also want to have any important changes sent to us in writing so that the residents can be well informed in all aspects of our living situation. In fact, many public housing residents are unaware of the new housing bill, but let alone what's contained in it. Okay, this is my presentation to what we should be doing.
Thank you.
To comment on the urban agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.